Hey guys, it's Misty from the Book Rat, and it's time for another Austen and August review. Today I'm going to be talking about Spies and Prejudice by Talia Vance. The full synopsis for this is below, as well as links on where to find it, but basically Spies and Prejudice is sort of a mashup between Pride and Prejudice and Veronica Mars, which if you like those two things, sounds kind of amazing. I think Spies and Prejudice probably works much better if you are familiar with both Pride and Prejudice and Veronica Mars, and ideally are a fan of both, because the way they're sort of mashed up, if you're going into it looking just for Pride and Prejudice, you're gonna have a bad time. There are gonna be a lot of things that maybe seem like they're off, or that's not how it would be in Pride and Prejudice, etc. And if you're not getting the Veronica Mars aspects that are worked in there, it's gonna seem really off character. And same if you are a Veronica Mars fan and you're not really familiar with Pride and Prejudice, you might be like, why was this character there? Where did this come from? Was this really needed? Things like that. So it is meant for people who like both and are gonna have a sense of humor about the two being mashed together. I think that's when it really kind of finds its audience and becomes really fun. So if you don't like either of those, or you're not really familiar with either of those, there's probably a much bigger chance that it's going to fall flat for you. But that said, as it is, and as someone who does like both, it was really, really fun. Now, I did have some problems, especially with the believability. I don't want to give anything away, but, you know, Veronica Mars itself really walked the line with believability. She's this very smart, very independent, very young girl who is doing things that maybe a, 16, 17-year-old probably shouldn't be getting away with or even knowing how to do, but it works in the context of the show. She's just a really capable person, so it makes sense from that aspect. So I expected that of Barry going into the story, and am willing to take that as believable, but when you start throwing in pretty much every other teenager around her also having some level of competence and knowledge and skill set way beyond what they should really have at 16, you start to lose some of the believability. Not everyone can be part of some kind of plot or have these really adult interests and jobs and skills without me starting to question, like, really? Really? And they all find each other, really? They do lose a little bit of the believability there, and I think partly you lose a little bit of the believability because of the pacing. I thought the pacing was definitely off. It's very, very quick moving, which does mean it's fun and engaging, but also means that things aren't developed and stretched out the way I would like them to be, which always sort of lets you down in the believability arena a little bit. It's one of the reasons that we hate insta-love so much, is because the pacing's off, which means our believability is off. And I think those two go hand in hand, which is why I mentioned pacing as a believability issue. It would have won me over so much more, and had the pacing been a little bit slower, a little smoother, and less rushed. In fact, some things I think probably could have been stretched out over a series rather than crammed into one book. I don't know that I needed the characters to necessarily come together in this one book, or the mysteries to be solved necessarily in this one book. I mean, if you look at Veronica Mars, that's 3 seasons of getting to know these characters and seeing how they fit together and slowly having mysteries unraveled, and I think that's part of what makes it so strong. For Spies and Prejudice, a lot of it is crammed together in a really short time in an effort to achieve the book in one book. Sometimes I think that it did a disservice to the two stories, especially because it is 2 stories. When you're trying to mash these 2 very different books into one, sort of interweave them and not just, Hulk smash them together. Because of those 2 things, I think that there will be some people, even those who are fans of Veronica Mars and Pride and Prejudice, who will be a little bit put off by the book. I think you'll still enjoy it. I think if you're a fan of those 2 things and sort of have a sense of humor about them being brought together, you're bound to find some things in this that you like, and you're bound to kind of fly through it. But will put some people off, and will make people feel like they're not getting enough of an understanding of who the characters are, how much Veronica and how much Lizzie is in Barry, and how much, Logan and how much Darcy is in Tanner. Because obviously, Logan and Veronica. So there are drawbacks, and there are things that are probably going to bother some readers, but setting all of that aside, it really is just a fun book. It's very lively, it's deliciously snarky. Talia really did sort of nail that Veronica Mars snarkiness and that sort of bubbly Lizzie wittiness. So things like that I think are sort of bound to draw the reader along. I will say that Barry does fall a little bit short of being a Veronica or a Lizzie. They are such immensely likable characters, even if they are very flawed. You can't help but kind of love them. And I think that Barry does cross the line sometimes into a less likable character. Sometimes she's a little more bitchy than snarky, and sometimes she's a little more insecure than either of those characters, and maybe not as good a friend as either of those characters are. But to mash up two such totally different but yet somehow similar characters, you are going to run into some issues, I would imagine. So Barry does still manage to pull it off and make me like her. I certainly would have liked less immediacy in the relationship, and that goes for both the hate and the love aspects. I personally always like a little bit of build-up. I think that's what really makes something stand out. But still, it was super, super fun, very fast-paced, and despite any flaws that it had, just enjoyable. Not to mention, how can you resist a concept like a Veronica Mars Pride and Prejudice mashup? I mean, you just cannot. You cannot. That is the answer to that. You can't resist that. All in all, definitely worth the read, and I'm very curious to see where Talia goes from here. This was strong enough for me to see where she goes and how she grows, and to definitely recommend it, even if it does come with some caveats. So that was what I thought of Spies and Prejudice by Talia Vance, which is out now, so you can already pick it up. And of course, make sure you stop by Austen in August, where I will have a chance for you to win a copy of Spies and Prejudice of your very own. Make sure you check out the rest of my Austen in August posts, both here and on the blog. The link to the schedule is below, and until next time, happy reading!